Chapter 27. Bug Jail. "What?" Wilbur asks, staring at Phil with a near frown. "What's wrong?" he asks, glancing down at where an injury should be. Techno moves forward to take a look for himself, forcing himself a spot beside Phil so that he may grab at Will's leg and see the damage properly. Or lack of damage, really. Wilbur looks down at him nervously, and Techno pokes an insistent finger at his skin in return, like that's going to reveal all its secrets. Will jerks back with a puff of air coming from his lungs, almost like a laugh. He tries to swing his foot at Techno. "Nothing's wrong, Will," Phil reassures, squeezing his hand around Wilbur's ankle for a second, before then trying to swat off Techno from persistently prodding at his brother. Techno makes a grumbled noise, but he complies, leaning into Phil's side and glaring at Wilbur's leg like he's threatening it to not make any problems. Phil reaches up behind him and messes with his hair to get rid of the menacing look. Technoblade only whines and pulls away, trying to hide into Phil's wings so that he's out of reach. "You said that's curious, so something's wrong," Wilbur insists, pulling his leg up onto the counter and tugging at his pant leg to try and get a look for himself. As he pats his palms up and down to try and find the wound, he realizes he's coming up with nothing. "Wait, where'd it go?" Skeppy walks into the kitchen then, with a kid on his hip that's earnestly trying to grab at the diamonds scattered over his face. He keeps leaning away from Tommy's hands, in a way that looks like it'll be a pain for his neck later on. "What's the damage then?" Skeppy asks, pausing in place at the pinched look on Phil's face. "Is it bad?" "Where'd it go?" Wilbur yells out, kicking off his shoes in a useless effort to search more efficiently. They narrowly miss Phil's leg as they land onto the floor, and Phil faintly wonders if that was just an excuse to be rid of his shoes. "It's gone," Phil answers to both Wilbur and Skeppy. "You're not going to find anything, Will." "But it was right here," Wilbur protests, rubbing at the same spot where he had gotten stabbed. "It was... You saw it?" He looks up at Phil, as if worried he won't believe him. Phil's expression must be trustworthy, though, because as soon as Will locks eyes with him, his worry fades away, only leaving pure confusion in its place. "Wait, what do you mean it's gone?" Skeppy asks, coming closer as Phil stands to his feet. Technoblade, now without feathers to hide behind, decides to go up to the counter instead, so that he can look at Wilbur over the edge. He stands on his toes to get the best view. "It's healed? Entirely?" "There's not even a scab," Phil mutters, taking Wilbur's leg again and finding nothing but unblemished skin. Not even a single mark to be found. "It had been bleeding when we were walking over here, but now it's not..." He stammers, waving a hand. "Did you heal him?" Skeppy asks, leaning closer and glancing at the necklace that sits around Phil's neck. "Or did he do it himself?" he suggests, ignoring the way Tommy's trying to gnaw on his shoulder. "I don't have healing," Wilbur denies. "I would have known if I did. It would have come in handy." He mutters, thinking of all the other times he's had to deal with injuries while on his own. "And I didn't do this," Phil adds, turning his head towards Skeppy. "I've never healed anyone before. My necklace, it only tends to my own wounds." "Huh," Skeppy says, adjusting Tommy a bit against his side. He looks dumbfounded. Phil feels the same. "Bad?" Phil hears a tiny snort from Techno at the way Skeppy yells Bad's name, and Phil smiles quietly as he turns his head towards the hall. For some reason, he expects to hear Bad before he sees him. He expects loud footsteps coming down the hall, stomping against the floorboards. But Bad is a quiet sort of person when he wants to be, so he doesn't make much noise as he comes into the kitchen. "What?" Bad asks, a hint of good-natured annoyance mixed behind his tone. There's still a fond look on his face even with it. Skeppy only hums, tilting his head towards Wilbur on the counter. "Do you think Will has healing?" Bad blinks. "Did he heal?" he questions, walking closer with new interest. "On his own?" "Looks like it." Skeppy shrugs, and Phil steps to the side to let Bad look at Will. Wilbur seems a little exasperated that everyone keeps needing to look at his non-injury. But mostly, he's just confused. A moment passes as Bad goes through the same process as Phil, checking for the injury, only to find nothing left behind. He goes an extra mile and makes sure Will can move his foot correctly and has no pain. And when everything appears to be in place, he just steps back with his hands on his hips and goes, "Huh. So, do I still get a bandage?" Wilbur asks, clearly letting them all know where his priorities lie. "Do you want one?" Phil asks, grinning towards Will with something like soft amusement. Wilbur swings his feet and gently hits his heels against the wood of the cabinets, narrowing his eyes with a bit of hesitation. "Maybe," he admits, and Phil laughs. He goes to get a bandage for Will's non-existent wound. "Wilbur, have you ever healed unnaturally quickly before?" Bad asks, tapping a finger onto his leg. Wilbur hums, trying to think. A frown pulls at his lips with the memories. In all his extensive experience he's had in being injured, try as he might, he can't recall ever healing quite so quickly like this. As far as he knows, wounds and cuts have always been something annoying, something lasting. They would take forever to go away, and it would always sting whenever he was running through the woods, or in a net, or in a cage. He shrinks down in the spot where he's sitting, shaking his head in response to Bad's question. "I don't have healing," he insists. He would have known. Or he would have used it by now, surely. Surely. Bad makes a thoughtful noise, not noticing the way Wilbur stares into his palms sitting on his lap. "Maybe he didn't have it before," Skeppy offers, waving a hand through the air. "Could be a whole developmental thing." "We have seen things like that before," Bad notes, turning his head to Phil. And Phil remembers that those two had indeed had a history of taking in monsters regularly. They must have seen a lot in those passing years. Healing is a rare thing, though. Aren't these kids apocalypse bringers? I'd expect them to have a bit of rare abilities. Skeppy points out, trying to put down Tommy so he'll stop making attempts at biting off the diamonds on his skin. Tommy kicks his legs with a whine, but he's put down on the floor anyway, despite his protests. Once there, he decides to make a run for it, crawling away to freedom. Techno scoops him up before he can get too far. "That's true," Bad agrees with Skeppy. "We have no idea how they're going to turn out, huh? Unless you got any idea, Phil?" Skeppy asks, and Phil shakes his head. "Then we're just going to assume they'll grow big and strong." He makes a flexing motion towards Will, and Wilbur blinks at him before sticking out his tongue in a mocking manner. Skeppy sputters in defense. Phil feels a weird sort of pride with that fact in the air. These are his kids, and while they're so endearingly small right now, they're supposedly destined to be apocalypse bringers. A fate like that, regardless of if it'll be carried out or not, is going to bring some daunting results. Somehow, the idea of them being so devastatingly powerful only feels like a positive to him, even with the threat of it all going wrong. Maybe it's because then no one in the world would ever be able to hurt them again. All he wants at this point is for no one to ever hurt his children again. Well, Phil brushes off those passing thoughts, taking hold of Wilbur's leg once more. If he does have healing, then why now? You think it's an age thing? He smooths out a Band-Aid onto where he thinks Will's wound used to be, perfectly gentle, as if the injury is still there. When he lets go, Wilbur looks down at it with a beaming smile, like Phil's given him a medal. Phil smiles back, then helps him down from the countertop. That, or stress, Bad says. And when Wilbur has both feet on the ground, he leans against Phil's leg, using it as a support to keep his balance. Phil can feel the tiny pinpricks of Will's claws in the back of his knee. We're not on the move anymore. We're as safe as one can be in their unique sort of situation. So maybe he's actually rested enough to let his body heal? Like with the necklace, Techno points out. Phil looks down towards him, almost laughing at the sight of Techno practically smothering Tommy in his arms. Tommy doesn't seem unhappy by it. If anything, he looks like he's taking a nap, curled up into the curve of Techno's neck. You said you need to sleep for your necklace to help you. But I've been sleeping, Wilbur declares. I've been doing really good sleeping, and this only just showed up. Ever since staying with Phil, Wilbur doesn't think he's ever slept this well in his whole life. First, it was the forest, with Techno at his side. Then he got to sleep underneath Phil's wings. And now they're in their own house, with that comfy bed. It only gets better and better. Maybe next they can sleep in the river. Now that would be nice. Although he has a feeling Techno wouldn't want to sleep with soaked clothes. Then it's an age thing, Skeppy decides, seeming set on that. Congratulations, kid, you've hit the milestone. He claps, half-heartedly. Bad claps with him, more enthusiastically. Wilbur just face-plants into Phil's hip. How do we know it was actually him, though? Technoblade asks, lifting his chin up high. Wilbur peeks out from Phil's leg. I mean, we don't actually know if he has healing. I think Dad just accidentally rubbed it off on him. Phil holds back a snort. What do you think we should do then? He asks, and Technoblade stares at Wilbur with consideration. We can test it. Phil tilts his head. He can feel Wilbur's claws dig a little further into his leg. Just for a moment. It lightens up right after. Test it? How? He pushes, voice slow, with an almost warning at the edge of it. We're not hurting him. Techno huffs. I'm not saying to stab him. Just give him a paper cut. Wilbur scrunches his nose with annoyance. You get a paper cut. Then we both see if we have healing. Fine. Techno agrees easily, and Wilbur blinks in surprise. He hadn't thought Techno would agree that quickly. He then frowns. Well, if his brother's doing it, now he's got to do it. You don't have to, Phil reminds. We can just go back to the garden, you two. Nope. Techno refuses, resting his chin on the top of Tommy's head. We have to see. You just want to find out if you have healing powers too, Wilbur accuses. Yeah, Techno confesses. Once again, quick and easy. Wilbur fumes at him. It'd be cool. Fine, Wilbur says. Phil, give me a paper cut. Phil sighs down at his son. He'd give anything for these kids, really. But also, his dad instincts are not agreeing with any of this. Techno has a point. A paper cut won't kill them. But Phil is tempted to insist to them both that they don't have to do it. They don't have to test anything. And they can just go back to the garden. Paper cuts are evil anyway. He endures through it. Phil is strong. He can deal with giving his 2 sons tiny little paper cuts. It's just to test their healing, to see if they'll be safe if they get hurt. Yeah, that's a good thing. Somehow, that doesn't calm his thoughts as much as he thought it would. If anything, he feels more apprehensive than before. Okay. Phil says, mostly to himself, as he picks Wilbur up from the ground to put him back on the counter. Techno passes Tommy over to Bad, and soon enough he joins Wilbur's side on the counter as well. Phil walks out from the kitchen for a second to search for his usual dagger. He doesn't trust any of the blades in the kitchen, even if they used to be his own so long ago. He finds the dagger in his room, sitting innocently on top of his desk. As he takes it and pulls the sheath off, he finds a heavy weight in his heart at thinking what Wilbur's possible healing could mean. It reminds him too much of the magic that's resting around his neck. Gods, Kristen had worked so hard on this. He remembers it. She was always one to be in tune with enchantments out of the 2 of them. Phil loved building, mostly, carving and such. She was one for the books, for spells and magic and languages that Phil only hears whispers of now. Wilbur might have that sort of magic naturally, just as he is. No outside influence needed, no lessons that have to be taught. He might just have it. They all could have that type of magic. Powers and enchantments that most men would spend years trying to achieve. He wonders what Kristen would think of that. He thinks she'd be fascinated, held in wonder just by the sight of his kids. They're worth that reaction, to be fair. Phil huffs, turning back and returning to the kitchen with quick steps. He makes a note in the back of his head to visit Kristen's grave later on today. He has to fix up that area there. Wilbur and Techno are waiting patiently for him on the counter, and Wilbur sticks his finger out at Phil the second he sees him walk in. Techno copies him not a moment later, and Phil gives them both a kind smile. He takes Wilbur's hand first, holding it carefully still so that he can be precise. With just one quick swipe, he gives the tiniest cut he can manage onto the back of his finger. He does the same to Techno right after. They both intently stare at their new injuries with a focus that's nearly impressive. Phil wipes off the knife with a towel, even if it's not really needed. He just needs something to fiddle with mostly. He glances at Tommy sleeping against Bad's chest, and his heart grows warm at the sight of him snoozing away without a single worry. He looks so terribly tiny in Bad's arms, considering how much bigger Bad is than the rest of them. It makes Phil want to cry a little. One of these days he thinks he will. Look! Wilbur exclaims suddenly, elbowing Techno to get his attention, even though Technoblade is already right beside him. He holds out his finger and stares at it intensely, and Techno lifts his finger next to his so they can compare. Phil quickly leans in with interest, then reels back with shock as he watches Wilbur's cut just disappear. It almost looks as if it's sewing itself back up, a direct reverse of what Phil did a moment ago. It fixes itself up into a little scab. Then that scab fades away within just a few seconds, Wilbur making a noise of awe. Within a single minute, his finger is perfectly unharmed. It's like Phil's blade never did anything at all. Techno's finger, however, still stays injured. Wilbur stares at it with a growing frown, his excitement quickly wearing off when he realizes Technoblade isn't healing like him. Dang. Techno says upon seeing his finger stay the way it is. He doesn't sound too disappointed. mostly just unimpressed. He looks at Wilbur's finger with a grin. That's cool. Wilbur beams once more. Yeah. He chuckles. And then jabs Techno in the side. Technoblade yells from the sudden attack. Ow! Maybe I can rub it off on you. By jabbing my guts. Ow, Dad! He lifts his foot up and begins kicking at Wilbur, Will screaming as he nearly gets knocked off the counter. Wilbur, Techno? Boys? Phil quickly stops them both, grabbing at their wrists. Let me see. They obediently show him their fingers, pausing in their play fighting for a second. Once Phil has confirmation in what he's seeing, he lets go, humming in the back of his throat. Whoa, he says, feeling a quiet sense of pride in his chest. That settles that, then. He looks to Bad and Skeppy, Bad seeming happy for him. Skeppy just looks vaguely smug. I need a bandage, Technoblade announces, holding his finger up at Phil, as if needing to remind him that he is oh so gravely injured. I want one too, Wilbur nods, raising his hand as well. Can I have one? He adds on, his words faltering as if he's not sure he can have it. Phil had said he could, but he doesn't know if that was a blanket statement. Yes, you can have one. Phil agrees, turning back to the medkit that still sits open by the sink. He tends to both their wounds, healed and not. They return back to the garden soon after. With Tommy having fallen asleep, Bad, at first, suggests that the kid can stay at the house to sleep better in the bedroom, with him and Skeppy keeping watch. With Phil's hesitation at that, he changes his suggestion, and instead offers that Phil try wrapping Tommy up so that he can be carried against his chest. Phil ends up doing that. Surprisingly, in the whole process of wrapping Tommy up in cloth, he doesn't stir one bit. He does, however, somehow try to bite Phil in his sleep. They really ought to find something for him to chew on. With one baby secured, and 2 paper cuts wrapped up, they go back on the overgrown path to the garden, returning where they left off. Phil reminds Wilbur and Techno to be careful of where they play, and they both agree to not go running around wildly until all the vines are cleared away. They instead go and try to find bugs hidden away in the leaves. Sounds like a fine hobby, in Phil's opinion, as long as they're not eating said bugs. His axe is still right where he put it, so he picks it up from the ground and resumes his work on cleaning up the garden, getting rid of all the overgrowth. He does it with a bit more of a ferocity than he had before. Maybe he has a grudge against the plants for tripping his son. Who knows? He'll never tell, and besides, it's clearly making him more productive. The sun is warm on his back as he keeps on cutting away. He ends up running into an old fence, and he finds the dirty path that he had once paved out through all the sections of his crops. It's too much work to clean all the dirt off from the stone. So he just keeps his focus on the plants, and tells himself he'll scrub it down later. For a moment, he stops in his work and pushes a hand against the fence he's uncovered. It creaks and groans with the slight push, complaining over the effects of time and how it has made it frail. Phil considers, for a second, on tearing the fence down. But that decision is then taken out of his hands when said fence seems to think enough is enough, and it falls over with a quiet snap. Phil snorts as he watches it descend into a bed of leaves, and he goes to pick up its remains so that no one will be stumbling over the splinters left behind. With that, he begins tearing down whatever fence he finds. It's not a hard task, considering how weak the wood is now, having been worn down from the weather and the wildlife. As he uses his axe consistently, He waits for the same humming from before to return. It's a passing thought, not of much importance, but he wants to hear it again, just to figure out what it was. Unfortunately, as 2 warm hours pass, he gets no results. His axe stays stubbornly quiet and functions just as it should. Phil feels a hint of disappointment with it, but he brushes it off pretty easily. He goes to check on Wilbur and Techno, wondering how their mission of finding bugs has been going. It takes a second to spot them amongst the mess of plants. He's been clearing them away for the better part of the day, and yet he hasn't made that much of a mark. Pity. But he finds them crouched down in a little open section they must have made themselves. "How's your bug catching coming along?" Phil asks, making his way over and seeing both their heads whip up to look at him. "Look, Dad." Wilbur smiles with a big grin, holding up what looks to be a centipede. Techno points at it, as if Phil needs direction on where his eyes have to be. "Mr. Legman," Will says, almost like an introduction. Phil tilts his head with a little laugh. "He's got legs for days," Techno says, nodding towards the bug, and Wilbur nods with him. "He's kind of slow, though." "I would think so." Phil humors them, kneeling down to their level. "Lots of work in moving all those feet. Maybe he gets tired." "He should take a nap," Techno suggests. "No rest for him." Will disagrees. "He's a criminal." "Oh, yeah." Technoblade nods, like he accidentally forgot that fact. "Why is he a criminal?" Phil asks curiously. "What crimes did he commit?" "Too many legs," Techno answers, shaking his head like it's a horrible offense. Phil shakes his head along with him, clicking his tongue. "Back to jail you go," Wilbur says, lowering the centipede back down. Phil leans forward and finds that they've taken the time to dig holes into the ground to keep their prisoners contained. "Should have had less legs," Phil murmurs, Wilbur giggling. Techno sounds as if he's holding back a laugh. "Look at this one," Wilbur says, reaching into the dirt and pulling a beetle out. "What's their crime?" Phil asks. "Bad fashion sense," Techno supplies. "It's a boring gray. Could have been a cool gray or a mellow gray. No, they're boring." Wilbur sounds so disappointed in the little bug. "Jail," he declares, putting the beetle back in its hole. "How many prisoners have you got locked up here?" Phil asks, glancing over the small piles of dirt that's thrown to the side. He notes, now, just how dirty their clothes have gotten. Probably due to them digging through the ground to find their guilty victims. They're all going to need a bath after this. 7. But there will be more, Wilbur says, sagely. The bugs must answer for their crimes. Techno drawls, leaning his chin forward on top of his knees. They get no weapons and no friends, but they do get a leaf. Wilbur then supplies a leaf into one of the holes. "Enjoy your leaf. Enjoy it while it lasts." Phil chuckles lightly. He nearly goes to ask about the rest of the bugs they've got trapped under their watch. But his questions are interrupted by an abrupt crying against his chest. Oh. Phil looks down at Tommy, quickly adjusting the cloth wrapped over his shoulder. "Hello, someone's awake." Tommy wails, clearly not happy with that. Both Techno and Will scoot closer to him. "Good morning," Technoblade greets, Tommy trying to reach a hand out so he can grab onto something. Techno offers his hand. Tommy grabs on. "Why are you crying, Phil asks, like Tommy can answer. He fully frees Tommy from where he's wrapped up in fabric and sits him down on his lap, trying to soothe his tears. What's wrong now? Maybe he's hungry, Wilbur suggests, leaning forward and nudging his head against Tommy's curls for a second. I'm hungry, he says, a clear confession. Phil gives a breathless laugh. All right, we'll go get something to eat. We should clean up anyway. You're all covered in dirt. You are too, Techno defends, pulling his hand away from Tommy's. Tommy whines with that, but he goes quiet at the noise of Phil giving a chirp. Wilbur tries to mimic the noise. It sounds a little funny, but it makes Phil's heart squeeze. Tommy says, reaching a hand up at Phil's face. What? Phil whispers, like Tommy's saying a secret. He sounds like Techno, Wilbur says then. Huh? Techno copies, but it's not as authentic as it could be. Tommy mimics, and Wilbur bursts out laughing. Techno laughs with him. Tommy continues trying to raise a hand up to Phil's face, so Phil leans in. When he does, though, Tommy then opens his mouth, trying to bite down on the tip of Phil's nose. Phil moves away before Tommy can succeed. Don't bite my nose, you lamb, Phil lightly scolds, and he gives Tommy a quick kiss on the forehead before moving to get off from the ground. He grunts as he stands up, and Tommy screams like he's trying to get all their attention. He's already got it. Come on, you two, Phil says, watching Techno and Wilbur get up with him. Let's head back. But what about our prisoners? Techno asks. They're gonna escape. Only solution is death, Wilbur says, and he kicks some dirt over the holes. Phil doesn't think that's going to kill them off. I'm sure they'll stay where they're meant to be, Phil fibs, moving through the garden towards the path back home. If not, you can track them down later. Don't move, Wilbur threatens, grabbing onto Techno's hand as they begin to walk away. If any of you leave your hole, there'll be no leaves for 1 whole year. Phil cackles with the silly threat. He's sure the bugs are absolutely shivering in fear. Sunset begins to creep up by the time they return to the house. Phil walks into his living room with lines drawn out across the walls, clear measurements scribbled out. He hums in satisfaction with the sight of it. It's a start. His first thought is to go start a bath for his dirty children, but he's distracted by a little something. Oh, hey, Techno says, pulling something out of his pocket. Phil finds it to be a small beetle, this time a light brown. A criminal. He tried to use us as an escape route, Wilbur gasps, leaning onto Techno's shoulder. He glares intensely at the creature in Techno's palm. Evil. Phil snorts, adjusting Tommy in his arms. Tommy snuggles into his shoulder. Let him go free, mate. But he's evil. Technoblade frowns up at Phil, like that's an obvious fact he's missing. He needs to be locked up, Wilbur declares. Forever and ever. He shakes his head, like there's just nothing else that can happen. Forgive him of his evil ways, Phil gently suggests, and he holds out a hand towards Techno. Techno puts the beetle in his palm. I'm sure he'll do better out there than in here. You can't set him free, Wilbur protests. He has to be locked up. Why? Phil asks. What's this one's crime? He expects something of the color again, or maybe something silly like he doesn't walk right. He's evil, Wilbur simply says. It's a lackluster answer. Evil beetle. Does he look evil? Phil questions, holding the beetle towards both Will and Techno. They seem to stare very closely. I think he just looks like a beetle. Nope. Techno disagrees. He's evil. Uh-huh. Wilbur shrugs. He's got a thirst for blood in his eyes, can't you see it? Phil laughs. He supposes he lacks a good sight for bug morals. All right then. Go fling him out into exile. He holds the beetle out, nodding towards the door. Wilbur excitedly takes the bug from him, Techno quickly heading to pull the front door open. Will throws the bug out at full force, watching it hurl through the air, all the way into the grass. Freedom! He yells. Go be free, be evil! Do crime! Techno adds, wanting to be encouraging. Kill a fellow bug! Phil grins with a slight wheeze, calling them back as soon as they're done yelling out towards their evil beetle. Go start a bath, both of you. I'll go figure out dinner. Wilbur says, his expression going sour. Evil. The beetle corrupted you. Go on. Phil urges them on, ignoring their complaints. You're not getting dirt into the bed tonight. They run off into the bathroom, Phil walking past down the hall. He heads into the kitchen. Skeppy's sitting at the table, bent over papers that are scattered across it, a pencil in hand. He looks almost frustrated as he squints at the drawings. Phil assumes they're plans for the construction on the house. Bad is nowhere to be seen. He knocks on the doorway twice, catching Skeppy's attention. Skeppy looks up from where he had been marking something down on a paper, and Phil smiles. Where's Bad? He asks, glancing around the kitchen like the demon might just somehow be hiding. Looking through your shed? Skeppy answers, looking back at the papers. That thing's a mess. Good luck to him. Phil murmurs, and Skeppy snorts. Hey, mind if I ask you a favor? Skeppy looks back at him, sitting up straight as a response. Do you think you'll be able to go down to the town nearby and gather us some potions? All the ones I had before are no good. And while we have the medkit, I'd rather not go without potions in case of anything. While Phil did prepare accordingly before leaving this place behind, having thrown out anything that would rot and putting anything away that might gather too much dust, he had failed to account for his stock of potions. Time takes its toll, and it's sure taken his damn potions. He doesn't trust drinking any of that. He's fairly sure his healing potions have turned green. Whatever that's turned into, he doesn't want to know. He's not finding out himself, that's for sure. I think we still have some gold lying around. Phil trails off, trying to think where he'd last left it. Tommy demands his attention then, trying to grab at his hair. Phil just blows a raspberry onto his palm. Tommy squeals. Skeppy hums in thought. Yeah, I could go. I was hoping to head out soon anyway. We need some stuff if we're going to remodel this house. We're just adding a second floor, Phil says, almost like a reminder. Which means stairs, which means making room for the stairs, which means cutting a hole through one of your walls and making a whole new wall. But yeah, I'll go. Skeppy shakes his head, cutting off the start of a ramble. Probably tomorrow morning. I'd have to take Bad with me, though. That's fine. Phil shrugs. He can handle the kids on his own for one day. Although, wouldn't he catch attention? Yeah, but he can carry all the stuff. Skeppy grins, and Phil scoffs. Just for the way back. He won't be going into town, don't worry. Just be careful. Phil warns. The main thing right now is just staying hidden. The last thing Phil wants is for this place to be found out. There's so much connected with him here, and it's his home, truly. With that piece of stone holding carved wings far past the trees, Phil knows he'd do anything to stay here. He'd fortify this whole damn forest if need be. This place holds love. Phil will have his kids growing up happy here. That is a promise. Mm-hmm. Skeppy nods, his eyes drifting back to the plans on the table. I've got it, Phil. And also, we won't need gold. Phil falters in confusion, Tommy babbling quietly to him. How are you going to pay then? Skeppy looks up, knocking his knuckles against the diamonds on his face. It clinks. I'm worth a lot. Phil clicks his tongue. Skeppy. Hey, don't give me that dad look, Skeppy says, and Phil nearly chokes. I'm just gonna chip a few pieces off. It's not painful. It's kinda like trimming my fingernails. He holds out his hands, as if needing to observe them. I don't need it. It'll grow back. He waves a hand, trying to push off Phil's small wave of worry. Phil huffs, rolling his eyes. Well, if it works. Here he had thought for a second that Skeppy was going to injure himself just to provide for them. That's a drastic decision they won't resort to. It does, Skeppy yells. I'm an expensive individual. Phil only laughs with that, and Skeppy clinks his knuckles against the hard surface of his face once again. Ah! Tommy yells, and Phil yells quietly back, mimicking the noise. Ah! Bah! Sheep. Phil says, looking for a pot. Wait, no, lamb. La. Tommy says, and Phil pauses. He looks towards Tommy. Lamb. Phil insists. La la la. Tommy repeats, and darn, there goes that chance. One day, Phil promises, and he kisses Tommy on the top of his head, continuing his efforts on dinner.